Today what I want to do with you guys is I want to give you some scope basics, and the scope I'm going to use is the Picoscope. It's our Pico automotive kit, and I'm just going to click on the icon on my screen, Pico 6. By the way, that is a free download from Pico. You guys can all download the software that runs. Of course, the scope part isn't free, but the software is. I mean, I think it's a limited version of it, but at least you can play around with it. I think that's the best way to do this. Okay, and then the first thing we want to talk about with this screen is this scale over here and this scale down here. Scale to the left, this vertical, this is our volts. And then the scale on the bottom is our time. So you've heard the terms time base. Well, that's our bottom or horizontal line is time. On this scope, what we have, let's talk about the time first. What we have is divisions, and I don't know if the camera's picking those up or not, but we have little blocks in here, and I can actually darken that too. I can change the pattern and actually remove it if I don't like it. And what we have is a total screen from 0 on this side to 50 on this side. But you'll notice that my time-based setting, which is up here, says 5ms/div. And what that means is each square on here, each division, is 5 milliseconds long. So you have to do some math and figure out that total screen, it's times 10, whatever you select up there in per division. So I think one of the first things that you need to understand about scopes is they're not all in per division. Some of them are per screen. If your preference is to change that to per screen, you can do that. There are settings in the scope that we can change this to per screen if that's your preference. But for us right now, this per division works. So we have 5 milliseconds per division, that's my time base, or a total of 50 milliseconds, that's my screen. Voltage on the left. Now I have a probe connected here now, that's why this line isn't 0. Let me take that off of here so we're clear on that. And this is actually not part of the Pico. This thing right here is actually part of my smart board. Let me throw this on the other side of the screen here. Okay. So our voltage scale to the left, right now it's on auto. Let's change that to 10 volts, plus minus 10 volts. What we're looking at here, this is my 0 line. I have 10 volts positive, 10 volts negative. This is really a 20 volt screen, and I can see, let's say you wanted to measure battery voltage, it's more than 10 obviously. We can actually just take that and scroll it down, and actually we can read above that, or will it give me an arrow? I think it will. Okay, I lied to you. I'm not sure. Let's check it. What I'm going to do here, just so I'm clear, I'm going to connect to the battery. We're going to watch this line here. Battery voltage is 12 volts. Let's see what it does. I'm just connecting channel A right directly to my battery. Okay, so I am connected to the battery right now, and you can see that we are not reading above this 10 volt line, which was my voltage setting. And we have this red exclamation point up here, and as an indicator that you are over the scale. And so if we want to see battery voltage in this case, we need to change our voltage setting to 20 volts, and then there's my battery voltage line. Okay, so we adjusted we looked at our time base, we looked at our voltage, and when you change those, what you're changing is the amount of time for each block or screen. So if we take our time base and we increase it to say 10 milliseconds per division, you see my total screen is now 100 milliseconds, or each block is now 10 milliseconds long. As far as voltage goes, you can see on a 20 volt scale, each block is about 4 volts. In fact, it is 4 volts. If I drop this down to a 5 volt, each block is 1 volt each. So again, that's per division this way, and our voltage scale to the left is kind of a plus minus scale on this on this one. I actually like that as a default because a lot of the stuff that we'll be doing, we'll actually see below zero voltages, especially when we're doing current measurements. And I like the zero line in the middle of the screen to start with. A lot of scopes will start you with the zero all the way at the bottom, and when I see that, what I always do as a default is I will pull that zero off of the bottom because I want to see those negative voltage numbers. I'm going to reset this back to our 20 volt scale so we see our voltage on our battery. There are other channels on this. You see channel B right here, and it's actually off right now. I can turn that one on. If I set that to a 20 as well, I want to look at another channel. And what we see is our voltage scale now for channel B is over here on the right-hand side. And so that would be if I want to look at another pattern. And really what we're talking about here, let me get you a picture of this. What we're looking at with this Pico is 4 different channels. And really the way that you can think about this is it's just a glorified voltmeter. If you know how to use a voltmeter, you'll know how to use a scope. And so we have 4 different channels. Think of this as 4 different voltmeters that you have that you can use at the same time. A really fast voltmeter. On the outside, this is a BNC type adapter. On the outside, this is the ground lead, and on the inside is our signal or our positive. And so each channel has a positive and negative. So channel A, channel B, channel C, channel D, we treat this like a voltmeter. When we connect to it, this is the lead that goes to this, and it just kind of twists on. And inside of this lead, even though it looks like one, there's actually 2 leads in here. There's a positive and a negative. And when you look at the other side of it, you know, that's what you got. And so we treat this just like a voltmeter when we connect it. Put that back.
Edit that up.
Put that back on the battery for me. Don't drop it. Okay, so right now we have 2 channels that we're looking at. If you wanted to have a third, you could do that. We'll just set them all at 20 just to be uniform. There's a 4th. And then my other channels, they're over top of each other right now. You can't see them. I can move them away from each other and we will be able to see all 4 channels at the same time. So really what we're looking at would be 4 different voltage traces that we can look at simultaneously. So this is a 4-channel scope. I don't know if I said that already. I think I did. 4-channel, 4 separate channels on the screen at the same time. We can look at whatever we want to look at. Cam and crank at the same time, combined with, say, ignition coil firing and injection if you want to. A lot of different options that we have with a 4-channel scope. Okay, I'm going to turn these other channels off right now. We don't need them for now. Okay, voltage, time base. I think the best thing for us to do now would be to look at a signal, and then we'll talk about some of the other ones. And what I want to do with you guys is not look at voltage, I want to look at current. And I think the one that I want to use is the low amp probe connected to an ignition coil. And I'll get you a shot over there in a second on what that looks like. But basically what we're going to do is take the positive lead that goes to the coil primary, this going to my engine computer, and I'm going to put an amp clamp, an inductive amp clamp, which looks like this. This is actually my high amp probe. I have my low amp probe already connected, and I'll get you a shot of that on the car. So what this does is you clip this over a wire and it reads the magnetic field of that wire, and we can convert that to an electrical signal, put it into our scope, and that's what we're going to do. Shot of the amp probe connected to the ignition coil. These are polarity sensitive. Take this off and show you. And what I was connected to, let's turn this light on. That's connected right there to the green and black wire. So that was the feed, and then you look at the amp probe and you see that inside of this there's actually a direction of current flow, conventional theory. And of course if it's backwards, no big deal. Just pull it off, flip it around. Or there are some invert features on the scope. You can turn it upside down with the scope too. Just your pattern will be upside down, no big deal. So either on the positive side or the negative side of the coil, we can read amperage. Now the thing with this inductive amp probe is it's not reading amperage. You're actually reading voltage. The conversion is done for you. The conversion setting we're using right now, I have my amp probe set on a 20 amp, and what the setting would be is every 100 millivolts equals 1 amp. And so every amp of current will generate 100 millivolts of voltage signal to the scope. You would need to know that if you didn't have pre-programmed channels. The nice thing about that is we do. So take the lead off the battery for me. Thank you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell my scope what I'm using, and I'm going to use my 60 amp current clamp in the 20 amp mode. And the nice thing about that is I don't need to do the math now. I don't have to do 100 millivolts equals 1 amp and then do all my math to figure out what my amperage actually is. It's already been done for me on my scales to the left here. Even though the scales are now listed as amps, is it really amps? It's volts. It's not amps. It's an amperage conversion. So go ahead and start the car now, and we'll see what this looks like. Okay, a few things that we notice right away. This line right here is not quite to zero. Amp probes have magnetic fields that interfere with them a lot. This amp probe's laying right on the back of the alternator, and so we have a little bit of interference from that. I can zero that out, but I'm not worried about that right now for what we're doing. I think the next thing that I want to cover with you guys is going to be triggering a signal. Changing the time base, triggering a signal when you'd want to do that. If we want to see repetition, what we do is we increase our time base. We want more time to look at on the screen. We see more of these. This is a single coil, 6-cylinder engine, one coil firing over and over and over again. If we want to see detail, what we would do is we would take our time base and we would drop it. And I think what you're seeing right now is we have a problem. And the problem is that signal is rolling off of the screen. And what if we want to see detail of the signal and we want it to stay still? This would be an example of when you'd want to set a trigger. And so I'm going to do that. Down here on trigger, I'm going to select repeat. And this little dot here on the screen is my trigger point. This is telling me some information about that trigger point. It is 50% delayed. It's set at 0 amps on a rising direction, and I want to cover these with you guys. I'm going to pull this up out of that. And so basically what I've done is I've told the scope to wait and don't draw the waveform until it reaches that point. And so the nice thing about this is the coil firing over and over and over and over again in the same location. Instead of walking across the screen, we will see every single event right here. That makes it nice if you wanted to look at detail and you wanted that pattern to stay still. So if I wanted to say zoom in on my coil oscillations, I can see them very nicely. As opposed to no trigger at all. If I shut that trigger off and that thing's rolling and I want to zoom on that one section, I really can't do it. On occasion you see it, right? It's not coordinated enough to see that. Now, of course, I know some of you are thinking, well, you could just pause the picture, and we could do that. We could pause it, and we could go through at the right time, and we could look at the buffer. And there's a frozen picture, and then we can zoom in. But the issue is, if you have an intermittent problem and you want to see it over and over and over again, you want to look at it live. So a frozen picture might not be the answer. So what we want to do when we want a pattern that's changing, that's on and off, and it's not consistent, and it's coming and going off of the screen, we want to coordinate that firing event with our scope sample. Set a trigger, and that's the answer for that. Okay, let's talk about the rising edge and falling edge now. Right now, we're telling the scope, don't draw the picture until it crosses 2.8 amps. That's what this line is right here. This would be what's called my trigger level. And right now, my trigger level is set on 2.8 amps. I'm telling the scope, don't draw it until it reaches 2.8 amps. And don't draw it unless it's in a rising direction. What happens if I tell it to draw it at that level? So this is my slope, by the way. If I tell it to draw that with a falling edge or negative slope, watch. Just change it. This will be a falling, so from high to low, and look where it draws the picture now. So our level would be this way, and our slope is either rising or falling. Okay? And then the delay, which is right here, this 50%, that's just wear on the screen. You see how I can't see this section of it right here? There's a couple of options that I could do. One of them would be just take your trigger and add some delay to it, which pulls it away from the edge, and then you can see the whole pattern. If you don't like where it's sitting on the screen, throw some delay into it. So trigger level, trigger slope, trigger delay. So when do you not want to have a trigger? The answer would be when acquiring a new signal. You never want to have a trigger set when you're acquiring a new signal. Let me pause this. Shut that Jeep off for a second so we're clear on what I'm saying. I'm not sure how much noise that's providing for the camera. You guys can see here that this pattern has really a maximum of about 5 amps of current. And remember, this is a voltage conversion here. It's an amperage scale. It's not really amperage, but we have a 5 amp reading here. Let's say, I'm trying to think of something that's lower amperage. Let's say that I want to look at a fuel injector. And a fuel injector on this Jeep probably draws about 1 amp of current. And so I take my amp probe off of my coil, and then I reinstall it on my injector, and I don't change any other setting. I would maybe still use the same amperage scale. We're not going to do that. But the thing is my trigger is set for 2.9 volt or 2.9 amps right now. And my injector only hits 1 amp. So what's going to happen is the injectors are firing down here. And I'll show you what it looks like with this. I'm going to move this trigger out of range. Watch. Start that back up. This is still on the ignition coil. If I move this trigger out of the range, notice what happens. Nothing at all. So let's say you're acquiring a new signal, injection pulse, and your trigger is set too high. You're going to think that you don't have injection pulse. Maybe it's a no start that can really throw you in the wrong direction, can't it? When acquiring a new signal, one of the things that you should follow is don't set a trigger yet. Make sure that your trigger is off. And with the trigger off or none, what we want to do is look at the level of our signal. Now you might want to increase your time base so we can see it a little bit better here. Can you see the level where we are right now? We're between 0 and 5 amps. So I know that if I set a trigger between 0 and 5, it's going to be pretty good. I set a trigger above that, it's not there. No picture at all. Why? Because the scope is waiting for the amperage to hit 7.9 amps at that level, and it's never going to hit it. So what's this auto do? The auto is going to draw the picture anyway. It's just not coordinated, it's not synchronized, it's really not triggering off of that. So the difference between auto trigger is if it's within its range, it will trigger off of it. If it's outside of its range, it will draw it anyway, it just won't be triggered. So a lot of people prefer an auto as a default. Okay? I can still move this down into that range, and now I'm triggering on that signal. I can lower my time base. Not sure where we were before. And look at the same picture we were looking at. So watch now, auto to repeat. There's no difference, is there? What is the difference? With repeat, if I go above that range, it's not there. Pull it back into the range. With auto, if I go above that range, it will still draw it, but it's just not coordinated. Above or below, for that matter. If I go below, it will still draw it. Repeat, it won't. Got to know what level you're at. So that's our trigger level. So a lot of you have asked me in the past, what do you want to trigger at? Like, what level do you want to choose? Well, there's really kind of a rule that I follow, and that rule is, where is a clean line? And if we would zoom in this area, you're going to see that this isn't so clean, is it? So I would not want this trigger down into this level. The reason why, let's go a little bit further, and let's pause that. Okay, shut that off for a second, please. Okay, perfect. When we're triggering, right now what we're telling our scope is to trigger in a falling direction. I have my falling one showing here at 2.4 amps. Right here is my trigger. If I set it right here, do you notice there's another spike in here? That as the signal's falling, so if I can draw it another way, as this signal is falling, there is a spike here, and then it falls again. So will this give me a little bit of a wobble, possibly in the pattern, if I set it there? Will it sometimes draw in this location and sometimes draw in this location because both of those are at the same trigger level in a falling direction? Did you see earlier how at times the signal was blipping on me? That was exactly why. I would want to stay away from that kind of setting for a trigger. If I set it down in here, it's going to be even worse. If I put it in this area, there's one here, there's one here, here, and here. There's 5 different places that scope can choose to draw that picture. They're all at the same level, and they're all falling edge signals at the same level. Let me show it to you. Let's see what it looks like. We'll set our trigger down into that range and see what it looks like. Go ahead and start that back up. And we'll go over here. And now I'll set my trigger down into this. Oh, something else before we do this. There is also, turn that off again, I'm sorry. There is also, in this pattern, right here, some oscillations, some up-downs. So is there a falling edge on these oscillations? Yes. Right here is a falling edge. Right here is a falling edge, falling edge, falling edge. So if I set that trigger in here, it may actually draw. It may draw this side or this side, depending on which one it chooses. Now, so when I pull this down into here, I'm not going to be surprised if this thing goes nuts and goes back and forth for that reason. Start that back up. Let's watch it. That starter sounds horrible, doesn't it? Okay, we'll unfreeze this. Go down to here. Pretty stable, even with all that noise. Let's try a rising edge. That's one we wouldn't want. See what's happening? There's some other noise in this picture, and at times it's actually triggering off a bit. There we go. That would be where we don't want to set a trigger level. So what's going on there? There's a rising edge on the other side. At that same level, there's a rising edge here. So when we set a trigger level, what do we want to do? Move it away from repeating, oscillating patterns. And so what we would do in this case, if we want a rising edge, let's move it over, and let's be somewhere in this area, right? Or maybe a trailing edge over here where it's nice and smooth up in this area. It's really going to depend on what you're working on and where you set that. All right, shut that off. The other reason, guys, that I choose to use repeat is when I lose a signal, it will keep it on the screen. Where if I'm set to auto, it's still running right now. There's no signal. I'm not frozen. If I'm set to auto, this goes away. And I think that's particularly useful when you're doing snap throttle tests looking at high ignition kV events, and you want that to stay put. I'm not going to show that right now. I don't want to get crazy with this. I want you guys to have a basic understanding. But I like repeat myself for that reason, rather than auto, is it will hold the last event on the screen. Now that can throw you off if you're a rookie, because you think you still have a signal, the car's running or whatever, and you have a signal on the screen and it's frozen. It's not live, even though it's still running. So just be aware of it. Okay, the last one would be the single. And really, when you have a waveform buffer like this does, I'll let you watch it. Watch up here. These frames here. If I pause this and then restart it, you're going to see these frames start to count. Actually, it will not because it's waiting for a trigger. So let's turn that to none. And you see these frames counting. When you have this waveform buffer, what you can do is look back at different screens. And it really makes the single trigger event not as necessary, but we still use it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a different probe, so I need to tell my scope that. I'm going to use the 600 amp current clamp, and you see my scales are a lot different now. And I need to come over to my scope and change that. And so I'll get you a shot of that. I'm going to connect to channel A with my BNC adapter, and this is my high amp probe. Turn it on, and what we want to do is make sure we're zeroed, and then I'm just going to connect this to the battery positive, and we're going to crank it over, and we're going to look at starter current. Now, I actually just connected to battery negative because it's easier. It's just polarity sensitive. If this line goes down on the screen, then I know my amp probe just needs flipped around. Go ahead and crank that. Okay, so we can stop that. We can come back and look at it. And really what we're trying to do is read the peak of the initial crank. And what we can do is we can bring this ruler down and we can measure that. So there's 423 amps on the initial crank of this start. The point of this waveform and why I chose this was to show you what this single trigger does. And what I'm going to do is start this again, set this to a single, set my level and my delay around this area, and I set it to 110 amps. When will this cross 110 amps would be when we initially crank it. And so the idea here would be to gather one screen, not have to worry about the buffer, and it will cross that point and it will draw the rest of the screen and then it will stop on its own, is what a single trigger event does. So go ahead and crank that and let's watch. Okay, good. Don't want to crank it when it's already running. Okay. So what we've done, we see the initial crank, we see the engine cranking, the engine started, and then where we actually cranked it while the engine was running. So very nice, thank you for that. That was good. No big deal. That's kind of funny. So what this provides you is a method of stopping the scope when you're not near it. If you're working under the hood and maybe you're the one that's cranking and you need to, hurry up, run over and hit the stop recording on the scope, you don't need to do that. Set it for a single. Another time where you might want to do that would be doing ignition events where you want to catch, say, the high firing kV of an ignition event, and maybe you're looking at an ignition waveform and it looks something like this on your screen, and when you snap the throttle, that same waveform is going to go way up here, and maybe that's where you have, say, like a lean misfire and you're trying to catch that event. What I would do is I would take this single and I'd set it up here in this area. When is it going to hit that area? Only on a snap. It won't draw it at all until it hits that snap, and then it will hold that picture there. It's a way to get a really fast signal that's coming and going to stay right there on the screen for you. That'd be another time I'd use a single shot, single trigger event. Okay, what I want to do for this last segment, and we'll do more of these too as we continue through this, I want to show you guys how to do triggering off of separate channels. So really our focus today was on trigger and time base, and so I think this will help to do this. So what I'm going to do is set my amp probe back to the ignition coil, my low amp probe, and I'll get you guys a shot of where those are at. Okay, for this one, back to the ignition coil. For channel A, all of my coil firings here, and then connected to a plug wire with my sync probe. And so I've already done that. I've told my scope I'm using the 60 amp current clamp in the 20 amp mode. That is my probe that I'm using. My scales are set up. Go ahead and start that. This is ignition. This is ignition coil primary. And when we triggered this before, we did something like that, and then we took our time base and we looked at it in smaller levels. And the thing about this, when you are, say, zoomed in this far, I think we were on a 20 amp scale before, but that's why it looks a little bit different, a little bit bigger of a picture. What you need to remember is this is the coil firing on all 6 cylinders. It's the distributor ignition. So every time that coil fires, we're going to draw this in that location. What I can show you is how to look at an individual cylinder. So let's come back out. And what I'm going to use Now, I wouldn't necessarily do it this way on a distributor engine, but this would be a good example on how I synchronize coil over plug engines. And what I'm using is an inductive pickup, little RPM pickup. It's also known as a sync probe. And I'm going to put this on the number 1 plug wire for my second channel, so you understand where I'm getting an impulse every time cylinder number 1 fires. It's going to send a signal into here. I'm going to pick that up and I'm going to put it on the screen. So channel 2 is going to be a sync probe connected to the number 1 plug wire. Set this to, I don't know, start with a 50 volt. There's 20, there's 50, and I need to turn that around. And what we can see here is every time this red line occurs on the screen, this is the number 1 cylinder. That's where I connected that to. What that gives me the ability to do is to focus on the coil event that is only the number 1 cylinder. So right now, if I were to zoom in on this picture, this is all 6 cylinders firing in the same location. Same coil firing, all 6 cylinders. If I trigger off of channel B, and set this up in my range where we were, again, knowing my voltage range, I'm going from 0 to 30 volts, somewhere in that range. So I'm now triggered off of channel B, and what it will do, triggered off channel B, is it will draw everything, all channels that are being acquired, it will draw. And now when I zoom in on that, changing my time base, I am simply just looking at the number 1 cylinder firing event, the coil, and really this trigger event occurring at the collapse of that magnetic field. That's when spark occurs. More importantly, what I've done is I've taken all 6 of those ramps and I've pulled one of them out to look at live. Not so much relevant for a distributor engine, I get that, but picture this for a second. Shut that off for me. A lot of you guys have seen me doing this in my videos, where I'm taking, say, 6 different ignition coils, and all 6 of those coils share one common power feed, which might be a fuse. I'm taking the fuse out, I'm installing a fuse jumper, I'm putting my amp probe here. And so when these coils are firing, I am going to see the impulse from every single coil through my fuse. If I have one particular coil that I want to focus on, what I can do is I can add a second channel, say synchronize off of one of these coils on a voltage waveform, and then I can figure out exactly which coil has an issue. I can zoom in maybe just on that one if I want to. When is this an advantage? Would be when the intake manifold covers all of these. You need to know how to do this. And so, you know, maybe not so relevant for a distributor engine like we're doing here, but at least you understand how to do that. You trigger off of a different cylinder and it will pull everything together or out of, in our case, channel A, where all 6 are firing. We pulled out the number 1 only ramp. This ramp, this event, is the number 1 cylinder firing. And that would be what else we can do with trigger. So hopefully you guys like that. And we'll do more with sampling and time base and some other stuff at a later time, but I think that's a good intro to scopes, and the stuff that we're doing here really applies across the board to all scopes, not just the Pico.